You are listening to All In, a podcast dedicated to helping you fulfill the mission of God in your life and around the world. I'm your host, Jeff Roper. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of All In. A couple of weeks ago, I came walking into my kitchen, smiling like the cat who had eaten the canary. And I was actually pretty happy, acting like a kid on Christmas Day. And my wife says, what are you so excited about? And I said, you won't believe this. I just got confirmation on the same day in the same few minutes that one of my favorite scholars and one of my favorite theologians have both agreed to be on the podcast. She goes, well, who are they? And I said, well, one is John Goldingay and the other is Miroslav Volf. She goes, well, who are they and what do they do? I explained, and she looked at me with that look like only wives can give husbands and said, you're such a nerd. But I tell you, I am just giddy over this. Today, I get to interview Miroslav Volf, who is a professor, a theologian, and in fact, I told my wife, he is one of my favorite living theologians. And in my book, that's a hard group to get into. Most of my favorite theologians are all dead. But to have a living one is an exciting thing. And the reason why is I want to explore with Dr. Volf a book that he wrote called Exclusion and Embrace, a Theological Exploration of Identity, Otherness, and Reconciliation. This book was rated by Christianity Today as one of the 100 most important books, religious books of the 20th century. And so today we're going to dig into the message of that and whatever else we may dig up. So Dr. Volf, thank you and welcome to the podcast.
Oh, it's fantastic to be here with you. I was just today, you mentioned John Goldingay. He was my colleague when I was at Fuller, and I was just today reading a bit in his commentary on Isaiah.
Oh, great. He is such a great scholar, and it was a joy to be able to interview him. And so it was as well as with you. And, you teach there at Yale, and I just love the stuff I see coming out of Yale these days. But, your stuff, your podcast, which I'd recommend to anybody to get into that, as well as your colleague, Matthew Crossman. I had him on the show last season talking about his book, and then historian Timothy Snyder. I don't know if you ever cross paths with him there at Yale, but boy, I tell you, I love his work as well. So kudos for you guys out there and what you're doing. Thank you so much. Would you tell us about Exclusion and Embrace? What was it? What is this book about, and what drove you to write this book?
Well, the book arose out of the war in former Yugoslavia, a war in which 2-3 ethnic groups that spoke the same language but were divided by religion clashed over identity, clashed over power, and left many wounded and many dead and many driven from their homes. And the question then for me was, how do I make sense of this theologically? How do I make sense theologically of the conflicts that rage between peoples and people groups? And more than just how do I make sense of this, is how do I go about thinking theologically about what can be done? How do I think reconciliation in the context of deep-seated conflicts? Mm-hmm. That basically got me going, and I think I was partly involved. My people were at this moment in the conflict. That moment in the conflict were the injured party, and for me in particular, then arose a question: how do we who perceive ourselves as being violated, what kind of stance do we take in the conflict of this sort? That's what gave rise to the book.
Because you're Croatian by birth, and you lived there until you were old.
Yeah, I was born there, and I was educated there straight through college, and returned also after I did doctoral work, and then taught for a number of years before I moved to California.
Yeah, and the tension that is there in that part of the world is palpable. Even today, you can see in that part of Southern Europe, Northern Balkan regions, uh, the amount of tension that is still there. I've been in the homes of people there in that region, still weeping today over the deaths of family members and people that have never been found since the conflict. So it's quite real. Now, were you surprised when the book was so well received?
Yeah, basically, I did not write the book. In the important sense, I wrote the book for myself
Mm,
and not for anybody else. And that may sound a strange way to be a theologian and to write books, and it may be maybe a bit self-absorbed if from certain angle. But it was a struggle that I had, and I knew that many people would have the same kind of
mhm.
struggle. And in many places of the world at that time, similar conflicts were raging on, including in the United States. Uh, and especially, that was one of those flare-ups of the um, of conflicts, of racial conflicts
Yeah,
that are underpinning that are always there in American experience and culture. And that's what I tried to sort to address. And I was very gratified that it was well received. It wasn't, I should add, it wasn't that well received in my own country.
is that right?
Because so people who are in conflict, they need a champion. They want a
Right,
champion. And anybody who wants to take away their enemy will become, in a sense, their enemy.
right,
And though I was, I clearly thought that Croatians were the violated party, but I couldn't deem them as innocent party.
right.
And that's part of what I was striving to articulate in the book, is that sometimes we think of the victims as innocent. And so we need the innocence of the victims to kind of motivate certain kind of self-righteousness in order to motivate the struggle. But I think one of the insights that I had is that in struggles of this sort, there really are no innocent people. The people who have been violated and those who are
Mhm.
doing the violating. But that should not be confused with kind of innocence and guilt or clear lines of demarcation. And so one of the challenges that I experienced for myself, I needed to make sure that the enmity that was part of the experience and conflict, that it didn't kind of insinuate itself into my own soul so that I wouldn't be made into the image of the enemy or into the image of the struggle that we felt was necessary, that um, that I wouldn't become devil to my devil,
I
so
see.
that I could become and remain faithful as a Christian. That was what I was striving to articulate, while at the same time taking seriously that violation has occurred, that struggle needs to be there, that it needs to be removed and not just simply put up with.
It's the perennial struggle of the Micah mandate, isn't it? To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly
Yeah, yeah,
with God all through the process.
exactly,
N-
exactly.
Now, 25 years later, after you wrote this book, you and your publishers apparently felt there was a situation that might be able to speak into again, because the book has recently been reissued, and I've worked through that book and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. But what were the things were there cultural movements, were there situations that you were seeing reemerging that caused you or your publishers to say this is still a message that needs to be spoken today?
So when I wrote the book originally, the world was in a kind of in the process of excited unification and globalization. In
Right.
Europe, European Union was being strengthened, especially because the Cold War. We were over the Cold War, and the wall between East and West has fallen down. And so in Croatia, you had this, in former Yugoslavia, you had these divisions, whereas in other parts of the world, Europe and more globally, processes of unifications were going on. But some 20 years later, we realize now that what was kind of excited attempt to kind of unify the world have had their shadow sides. And over the past 5-10 years, depending when you draw the line, the world has been progressively moving apart in some ways, so that the kinds of struggles that we experienced in former Yugoslavia have now become ubiquitous. They're part of the larger experience of Europe with the rise of new European rights. They're part of larger global politics with China, Russia, India, all asserting their own national identities, as well as we have seen in the past 4 years and more in the United States. So we are globally at the place where we were then in a more local sense. And a friend of mine actually from England, has written to me and said, Miroslav, your book is today more relevant than it was when you originally wrote the book. And then I realized, this book has something to say to the present moment.
Right. Probably the scariest line that I read in the whole book, at least this time going through it, was, you said the whole globe looks now more like Yugoslavia did on the eve of the outbreak of hostilities among its ethnic groups.
Yeah, I had that distinct feeling when I was, I'm trying to remember when that was, not too long ago, in maybe 4 or 5 years ago, in Europe, and there was a large public event in Munich on the major square together for Europe. And when I was spending a little bit of time in Europe and in Germany in particular, and I felt almost in the air, you could see this kind of tense enmity between various groups. And something that I wouldn't have expected to experience and can't really describe. That's this kind of internal feeling, and the same feeling I had in the United States over the past 4 years. And I think I wouldn't want to suggest that anything is inevitable, but certainly that I felt we had to work very hard so that we could push back against the conflicts. And unfortunately, as was the case in Yugoslavia, so also in the United States, Christians were often at the forefront of the kind of stoking the struggle.
Right.
I think part of reason was similar, that there is a kind of, in America, especially among evangelical Christians, American Christianity is very complex, and I don't want to simplify things, but there is a certain segment of American evangelical Christianity that kind of advocates something like Christian nationalism. We are a special kind of a nation, and we're a special kind of a nation because God has a special relationship and even mission to us. And it's this character of our nation as a Christian nation that has to be reasserted and has to be preserved. I think similar kinds of imagination in a different form, but not very dissimilar, were at work in former Yugoslavia. Serbia thinks of itself often as heavenly Serbia. There's a kind of heavenly corresponding part,
right?
Right. So the legitimacy of the nation is grounded in this sacred history. The same is true of Croatians who evoke God and Croatians. It's a kind of a phrase that belongs together. So you had a sense of defense of national identity or struggle for national identity in face of what was perceived as a significant threat, and which means that then identity struggles were sacralized. They were carried in part in God's name, And that's what gave me, in some ways, I think the best word maybe to describe is chills. I am, I grew up in a small Pentecostal church where we were minority of the minority of the a minority, kind of holiness Pentecostal, not the kind of Pentecostalism what I sometimes call machine gun Pentecostalism, that is all about waging this incredible war with the help of Yahweh and taking down the fortresses and so forth. And I mean, in this kind of minority situation, it was really crucial for us, particularly for the family in which I grew up. My father was a Pentecostal minister. He was then general secretary of the Pentecostal movement. But he has found God in the experience of, or God has found him in the experience of great suffering in the labor camp. And he has, I think, just because God found him in this suffering, never been developed hatred toward his tormentors, because the grace of God has saved him from his own rage against the tormentors, right in the middle of that. And so he's emerged as this person who, I'm sure he has tensions within himself, but who certainly, in all conversations that I've had with him, was standing for the purity of the gospel, for following the Christ, for the one who was there with him when he was enemy of God because he was cursing God in the process of this, and then developed a theology that was that sought to follow the crucified. And that was the tradition in which I grew up. And to that tradition, I wanted to be faithful in the book.
Now, what is so dangerous about this identity politics, especially when we take I think the language you used in the book, this monotheistic God who is master of the universe, and we reduce him down to being our tribal God or our national God or our political God who, maybe GOP means God's own party or, or whatever group, the party of God. What is so dangerous about that?
Well, there's something dangerous about this at the religious level, at the Christian level. And the danger of that is that I have taken the master of the universe and made God into my soldier. That I'm the general and he's there to fight my battles. I have decoupled God's power from God's character, and I have removed God's character from having claims upon my life, at least God's character as it has been revealed to us in Jesus Christ. So that's the kind of Christian danger of it. But there's obviously social danger to it, and namely that I take what I perceived to be my right and legitimize this by appeal to God without necessarily going through the process and examining what kind of effects it has upon other people, how the rights of others, how the dignity of others, how the fact that they were created in the image of God figures. So I then end up not loving but hating my enemy. And I personally think that if you take love of enemy out of Christianity, you've unchristianed the Christian faith. That's a bedrock of the Christian faith. And you have then kind of reduced the other person who was created in God's image, for whom Christ died, simply to an obstacle to your goal. My sense is we need to honor everyone, every individual human being. And that's what God demands of us.
So in the book, you talk about this issue of identity and then exclusion, which is part of this, right? And violence can play into this, where you can use violence against the other because they're an obstacle that comes into play.
Yeah, and you feel that you have God on your side, and that you represent God, so that your cause is God's cause, or you draw God into your
Right.
your cause. And the other person then becomes an infidel. The other person then becomes somebody who's in God's way and not just in your way. And suddenly you've taken yourself out of the common sinfulness of humanity and elevated yourself to some divine holiness, and you have plunged the other one into demonic and devilish depths. And once you divide humanity in this way, you have justified often atrocities.
There was a British researcher wrote a book on the theory of virtuous violence. And the premise of the book was that so much of the violence that is done in the world today is done by a virtuous motive, to restore honor, to restore glory, to right a wrong, that somehow people engage in this is a right thing to do. It's the people who attacked the U.S. government on January 6th were convinced they were doing violence for a virtuous cause. The people who were exterminating their neighbors in the Yugoslav war were doing it for what they were convinced was a virtuous cause. And you say in the book that the epicenter of the book really, though, is not that. It's the embrace, the radical call to embrace the other. That's the central piece of the gospel. Unpack that. What does that look like when we do have clear disagreements? Because I think sometimes people think we think that we have to agree with them before we can embrace them. And Jesus was really serious when he said we have to love our enemies. How do we live as Christians? How do we live worthy of that humanity and worthy of that calling to fully, radically embrace the other?
Yeah. So earlier you mentioned that people always need or believe that they're doing the right thing, even when they're committing a great deal of violence. And I think that's a kind of compliment that vice has to pay to the virtue to be vice. Sin doesn't want to be sin, and therefore needs justifications and employs justification in order to portray itself as being other than it truly is. But that also testifies that the person who commits violence actually hasn't lost all the goodness.
Right.
Otherwise, they could simply do the violence without any reference to
just
any.
for the fun of it.
Just exactly, for the sake of doing violence, and yet we don't do that, right? So even there, you see that that you can recognize something of the image of God, even in the person who is who's violent and with whose behavior you cannot agree. I think for me the central question was what I've called in the book the will to embrace.
Okay.
That is to say, I need to have the Christian, if love of enemy is central to Christian faith, then I need at least to will to love the enemy.
Yeah.
Right? And then to consider this to be a value, a virtue with which I identify. I may fail, and we often fail. We often fail in a trivial kinds of ways, let alone in some major ways. But once I realize that this will is something that needs to have claim on me, then the process can begin, process of self-transformation, so that I can actually become a person who is able to embrace another person. And to embrace another person, it does not mean to embrace their what they have done. I think that forgiveness for me is paradigmatic of how one relates to those who have committed wrongdoing.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, forgiveness is not saying that what person has done isn't wrong or that it doesn't matter,
Mm-hmm.
but identifying it as wrong while at the same time not letting it count against the person.
Right.
Right. So this dynamic of identification of something as wrong, but not counting it against them, that is fundamental. And then I think the next step is to ask, well, what is the purpose of forgiveness? And the purpose of forgiveness, today when we listen to various pop psychologists, they'll tell you purpose of forgiveness is to kind of attend to your own inner rage, so
Mm-hmm.
that you can move on rather than be captive to this. And there's a little book that I wrote called Free of Charge, on forgiveness and of giving and on forgiving. And in this book, I have argued that actually the purpose of forgiveness is not some kind of peace, inner peace, for you to achieve inner peace. The purpose of forgiveness is to return the wrongdoer back to the good from which the wrongdoer has fallen when wrongdoer has harmed you.
Wow.
And that's a Luther's idea. Original, very early on, he said that the entire gospel is about forgiveness, but forgiveness is about returning the wrongdoer to the good from which they had fallen.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to me, that was that's what gave trajectory to my work, and that's what gives, I think, trajectory to our own stance toward those who have harmed us, small ways, big ways. Namely, we work toward returning them to the good from which they had fallen. That may involve a variety of things, right? But that's what we are after. We're not after destroying them.
Right. That is so good. That is so good, because in this polarized world that we live in right now, having been in the U.S. now for the past year due to this pandemic, and having to live right up front of front row seat of the political divides and stuff, that something you said echoed in my heart. Historically, Christians have often been at the forefront of pushing some of these issues of the politics of the identity politics, like you mentioned in Yugoslavia, where the idea of, it was many Christians in Germany that supported Hitler. We've tried to rewrite that history, but he promised to rebuild German greatness and protect Christianity and defeat the communists, and the Christians supported him. What does that say about us in the deficiency? Is there a deficiency in our theological understanding in general amongst Christians? And if there is, what can we do as Christians, especially leaders at various levels of influence, pastors and local church leaders? What can we do to help move us towards a better version of our Christianity?
That's a very good question. I think it's partly connected to the question of which is, I'm just restating actually how you phrased it. Why have we participated, Christians,
Right.
historically, for centuries?
Yes.
In atrocities, and saw ourselves as good Christians in doing that.
Right.
And I think there are obviously many factors, and this is a question we could spend a lot of time discussing and kind of teasing out different aspects of it. But it has always seemed to me that, and increasingly so in the course of the studies, is that where Christianity goes, Christian faith goes wrong, is where other religions, by the way, also go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Namely, when they closely tie religious convictions to the struggle for political power.
Yeah.
Connection between religion and nation, religion and political power,
Mm-hmm.
Not political engagement, but political power is fundamental here, because often we think, oh, if we just had somebody at the top in the government
Right.
who is a Christian, right? This would be so great. The cause could be furthered, and as it turned out, Christianity, Christian faith ends up often being servant of politics rather than master of politics, right?
Right.
But you can have politics or anything human being Christ's master, or being God's
Mm-hmm.
master. And I think so. So in many ways, I think the reason is unacknowledged idolatry.
Yeah.
Idolatry of the state, idolatry of the identity of the group to which I belong, or the inverse of that is fear, right?
Yeah.
Fear that leads often to idolatry. And I mean, I've just recently been reading extensively in Exodus and have spent time with the incident of golden calf,
Mm-hmm.
which is a kind of classic example of idolatry in the Bible that threatens to undo the covenant that God has had with Israel. And you see Moses is up on the mountain with God, receiving the book of covenant, right? They were just to come back with the plans for the temple and with the tables of the tablets of the law. And Israelites are 40 days without him, and they suddenly think, wow, what are we going to do now? It took them 30 days to be 40 days to be totally frightened. Who's going to go ahead of us? What's going to be of us? I can understand them, right? 40 days in wilderness. I mean, who knows what I would have done, right?
Yeah.
And so we can go along into that story. But so whether it's kind of fear that motivates it, which is also a certain form of absence of trust.
Mm-hmm.
Trust is the one who holds history, their hands, or idolatry, which is kind of the flip side of it. That's often what it is. We need strength to protect ourselves, and we think that we can gain that in numbers, and then we kind of use God to support the struggle that we have.
Yeah, this has been so rich. There was a line in your book along this line that whenever there's the demotion of God from master of the universe to a lackey of a particular group's interest, period, to be clear, politically engaged monotheism is not a betrayal of monotheism. Monotheism as political religion is the betrayal.
Yeah. So that's what I try to differentiate between political religion and publicly engaged religion. And political religion is basically religion of a particular entity.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost, you can say, a local deity. And often people speak of monolatry, belief in one God, and then that one God, if that God is not God of the entire world, then it becomes a God of that particular group, and then fights the struggles and fights and wars of that particular group. Once that happens and God becomes a kind of tribal deity, then it's very easy to it's a theological misuse of religion, but it's also political misuse of religion.
So, from your research and your experience, what would what would be some things that we could do as leaders of local congregations uh, to help turn the tide, so at least the Christians that we help influence, and the communities of which we are a part, are no longer at the forefront of advancing some of these atrocities. I mean, I don't want to be a participant. I would like to be the alternative community that Jesus calls us to. What can, how would that affect our teaching, our preaching, our serving?
I'm asking myself always this question, especially over the past 4 years. I've been tweeting more maybe than I should have, and I was active in media, partly because I was thinking through the issues that were happening, and so this was my way to kind of process what was occurring. But it seems to me that it's such a complex way of being faithful, meaning that it involves not one or two things, but it involves an entire orientation of life. And then one can take bits and pieces of it and then analyze it. But I think the central to it, who is your God? Again and again, ask the question. And to me, I think what I was struck this time, also over the years, is how much Jesus is a moral stranger to our culture and to the Christians today. I mean, it's nothing particularly new. I was just in the evenings I read. I often read some of the sermons by Martin Luther. Luther is my favorite ugly theologian.
Okay.
Because he's ugly in many ways, but he's also at the core is a gem of amazing value. And then he's constantly talking about people of his time not appreciating who Christ actually was. They want to make Christ into somebody else, servants of their own self-righteousness. But to the extent that people think of themselves, American thinks of themselves, or conservative Christians think of America as a Christian nation, I think it should give us a big pause how far we are from anything that one finds in the Gospels of who Jesus Christ was.
Right.
Most of what he was after, we're not particularly interested.
You mean
most of what
he wasn't for gun rights? And I mean, I thought that was in the Bible.
What was that?
You mean gun rights and
that's right.
All of the things that we think
and a whole slew of things on the basis of we organize our entire life around these things. Jesus has nothing to do with it, or very little to do with it.
Yeah.
And so I think a renewed appreciation and honoring of Jesus as our Lord.
Yeah.
And not just as our limpid savior.
Yeah.
Which just rescues me from whatever I think is my problem, but doesn't shape the way we live in the world. So I would say that, and I think right now at the present moment, I think truth is, we have little interest in it. And sometimes when we have interest, we don't have enough interest to kind of look behind the veneer of social media, and not just social media, but also kind of medially mediated reality.
Right.
So as to recognize what actually is going on and align our lives with the truth.
And do you think that that truth has been probably the first victim of this whole conundrum that we find ourselves in? Maybe love. I think maybe love is the first, truth is the second, perhaps. But because now you look at if I were to look at my Facebook feed, I would think, first of all, I need new friends. because of some of the stuff I see, and I'm going, this isn't love. This is hatred. This isn't truth. These aren't lies, but these are my fellow believers that I know love Jesus with all their heart.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, love some Jesus.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. The parts of Jesus that we like. Well, Professor, it has been a joy to have you on the podcast today. It's been a delight. I so appreciate it. I do have one more question. I ask this of all my guests. If we had a time machine and we could go back in time to your 25-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Oh, that's a very good question. Major on the major things.
Very good.
Concentrate on what truly matters, and don't let yourself be distracted by the foam of the waves around.
That's great. Well, Dr. Volf, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a joy.
Same. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it very much.
Hey, before we go, I want to remind you that you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. Also, I'd like to encourage you to share this episode on social media or through email. Get your friends and family involved if you think it'll help them. And finally, if you benefit from this podcast and or you believe in our ministry of making disciples of nations by developing healthy Foursquare church planting movements, would you consider partnering with us in prayer and even financial support? Go to my website, jeffroper.com, and you'll see the link there that says support our work. We would appreciate it. It helps make this ministry possible. God bless you guys. It's your life. Now go live it.